there's no excuse for that. And you think, well, you know, we're going to destroy the planet. We have to do this. We have to demoralize the youth to be ethical. It's like, yeah, really, that's your theory? You're going to demoralize young people to be ethical? You have no idea how many people that's killing.
Incoming freshmen next year, University of Toronto, Stanford University, 18-year-old kids coming into this. We've been through 3 years of COVID. I won't rehearse it all. What would you say to them as they begin university at the age of 18 or 19? What's the restorative, the redemptive sentence? What should they do?
Don't be thinking your ambition is corrupt. You know, because that's part of the message now. Human beings, we're a cancer on the planet. We're headed for an environmental apocalypse. The entire historical structure is nothing but atrocity, etc., etc. Anyone with any ethical aim whatsoever is just going to pull back. You don't want to manifest any ambition, support the patriarchal structure, exploit the environment. You've got to crush yourself down. You shouldn't even have any children. It's like, no. There's no excuse for that. There's zero excuse for that. I saw a professor at an event, something like this. He came out and trumpeted this bloody, environmentally friendly house he'd built. And, you know, fair enough, man. It was a pretty interesting house, but not everybody had the $4 million that it took him to build it. And I'm not criticizing his money even. It's like, he's had some money. Good for him. He built a house. Okay. But then to trumpet that as a moral virtue, well, you're pushing it there. And then he came out to all the kids and he said, you know, my wife and I decided that we were only going to have one child. And I think that's one of the most ethical things we could have possibly done. And I would strongly encourage you to do the same. I thought, you son of a bitch. You get up in front of these young people. A lot of these kids were children of first-generation immigrants from China. And he showed all these images, you know, of these terrible factories in China, these endless rows of sterile mechanism that were subordinating all the Chinese people to this terrible, you know, capitalist machine. And I thought, you don't understand. Half the audience is looking at those factories and thinking, that's a hell of a lot better than struggling through the mud under Mao, buddy. And so, I don't know where he thought he was, but to come out in front of all those kids and basically tell them that the whole human enterprise is so goddamn corrupt that the best thing they could possibly do is limit their multiplication, and to think of himself as a scholar and an educator, it was just, I did say something, by the way. It was rather uncomfortable, and he stomped off the stage. But that's no message for young people. There's no excuse for that. And you think, well, you know, we're going to destroy the planet. We have to do this. We have to demoralize the youth to be ethical. It's like, yeah, really, that's your theory? You're going to demoralize young people to be ethical? That's your theory? It's like, you should go home and think about that for like a year. And I'm passionate about this, you know, because you have no idea how many people that's killing. You have no idea. I see people everywhere, all over the world. They're so demoralized, especially young people with a conscience, because they've been told since they were little that there's nothing to them but corruption and power. It's like, how the hell do you expect them to react? You know, well, I shouldn't do anything then, you know.
I want to know, what is your answer to young people for some of the really big problems facing humanity, like the climate catastrophe, like economic crisis, like the precarious job market? Because they just don't, like, you talk all this much about individual responsibility. Most of us are never going to be able to afford to have all of these assets to have responsibility over. So what is your advice beyond banal comments like clean your room?
Well, you know, it's actually rather difficult to answer a question that ends with your comments are banal, politely. I would consider that more of an opinionated personal and political statement than actually a question. So why don't you try reformulating that so that there's an actual question there?
So what is your advice to young people when you talk about you need to be individually responsible, but when there are things that are so far out of our control, like climate catastrophe, like the precarious job economy, like the economic crisis, what is your answer to people who are facing these questions?
Do you think that you're worse off than your grandparents?
I think there are different challenges.
Do you think you're worse off than your grandparents?
I think that
Jordan, once again, we're not going to cross-examine our question.
Fundamentally, I'm a psychologist, and my experience has been that people can do a tremendous amount of good for themselves and for the people who are immediately around them by looking to their own inadequacies and their own flaws and the things that they're not doing in their lives and starting to build themselves up as more powerful individuals. And if they're capable of doing that, and then they're capable of expanding their career. And if they're capable of expanding their career and their competence, then they're capable of taking their place in the community as effective leaders. And then they're capable of making wise decisions instead of unwise decisions when it comes to making collective political decisions. I'm not suggesting in the least, and have never suggested, that there's no domain for social action. I'm suggesting that people who don't have their own houses in order should be very careful before they go about reorganizing the world, which happens in many ways. I think generally people have things that are more within their personal purview that are more difficult to deal with and that they're avoiding, and that generally the way they avoid them is by adopting pseudo-moralistic stances on large-scale social issues so that they look good to their friends and their neighbors. That's what it looks like. And that's why the overwhelming proportion of people who are in prisons are male. Now, do you want to equalize that? What about bricklayers? They're 99% male. And we've got about 3/4 of the population now in universities in the humanities and social sciences are female.
Yeah.
Are we going to equalize that? Men work longer hours. They work more dangerous jobs. They're more likely to move. They're more likely to work outside. They're more likely to participate in jobs in the STEM fields that are scalable. They make more money for those reasons. And that's all hidden under the idea that the reason...
What do you understand by equality, Sophie? What does it mean to you?
Freedom.
Can you be more... Is it equality of opportunity? Is it equal pay across the board? Is it something more than that?
I think equality's better for everyone. I
Yeah,
think,
okay.
you know, and I'm really delighted, you know, I love my job because it's an optimistic and a hopeful job, which is about creating more choices for people. I'm interested in people being able to have different choices and having equality of outcome.
Aha, well, so you're going to have choices and equality of outcome. What if people choose different things, which is what they've been doing in Scandinavia? So the Scandinavian countries have moved more towards gender equality than any other countries, and the personality differences in Scandinavia have increased rather than decreased, and the proportion of women who are choosing STEM fields has decreased rather than increased. So as cultures become more gender neutral, the number of women who choose STEM fields decreases.
What do you mean
not
by STEM
increasing.
fields?
So science, technology, engineering, and mathematics.
I
So if
think
you let
actually-
men and women make their choices, what actually happens is that they specialize in different situations.
Could they
and you
not-
don't get equality of
Could they
outcome.
not have been programmed to have those views from the moment we raise them and give boys Lego and construction?
No,
girls?
because what happens is that as countries get more egalitarian, which means there's less programming of that sort, the differences get larger, not smaller. And the scientific data on that is clear, and most of it was generated by people who have a left-leaning bias, so you can't blame it on conservative scientists. It was a shock to everyone to find that out.
Sophie,
I think the difference between Jordan and me is that we look at evidence and we lean towards different theories. So Jordan's theory is very much evolutionary, you know, that there are inherent differences in men and women. Mine is very much more social role theory, if you like, and that men and women are taking on different roles due to the expectations that society puts on them. And it's interesting that Jordan frequently cites Scandinavian countries where they've made more, like there's nowhere in the world that women are equal, but Scandinavia has made the most progress towards shared parenting, etc.
Yep.
That said, it's not done yet. There's nowhere in the world where this is done yet.
But it's having the opposite effect that the gender equality types predicted. Opposite, not the same.
No,
and it isn't a theory, it's actually data driven by tens of thousands of surveys and the best scientific literature on the topic. It's not a theory, and I didn't come about it because of my political perspective. I looked at the data. What it showed was that as countries become more egalitarian, the differences between men and women grow, they don't shrink.
So what I'm interested in is data and analysis as well, and I'm particularly interested in the ones presented, such as the ones by the University of Southern California, which discovered that change towards gender equality is actually being slowed by beliefs that are legitimizing social inequalities on the basis of sex. And I'm also interested, I mean, like Jordan, I look at the data and I look at the studies, and I'm really also very much interested in studies like the analysis that was done by the American Psychological Society, which looked at 45 analysis of whether there's sex difference over 20 years. And its conclusion was that men and women are basically alike in terms of personality, in terms of cognitive ability, in terms of leadership. But what it did find was that media depictions of men and women as fundamentally different perpetuate misconceptions, as does workplace bias.
Oh God, so it's my fault.
So, no, well, you know, you're leaving soon. It's
Men and women actually are more the same than they are different. But the issue is that small differences at the population level can turn into very large differences at the extreme. So, for example, men and women are broadly similar with regards to aggression, although men tilt a little bit more towards aggression. So that if you picked a random person out of the population, male and female, and you guessed that the male was more aggressive, you'd be right 60% of the time. But if you take the 1 in 100 most aggressive people, they're all male. And that's why the overwhelming proportion of people who are in prisons are male. Now, do you want to equalize that, just out of curiosity? What about bricklayers? They're 99% male. And we've got about 3/4 of the population now in universities in the humanities and social sciences are female.
Yeah.
Are we going to equalize that? And men work longer hours, they work more dangerous jobs, they're more likely to move, they're more likely to work outside, they're more likely to participate in jobs in the STEM fields that are scalable, they make more money for those reasons, and that's all hidden under the idea that the reason that men and women make different amounts of money is because of their gender. It's a very simplistic analysis, and trying to
Michael,
address
I was just going to say, quite Sophie, can you come back on that?
What I'm trying to equalise is opportunity and choice.
Fine, let's
And
equalise choice.
You agree on that.
But we won't get equal outcome that way.
And I think that what happens then, nobody knows, because we've never done it yet.
We do know. We know what's happened in Scandinavia.
But it's not fully got there yet.
No, but it's going in the opposite direction that everyone predicted, and strongly.
You know, I think one of the things I loved about Jordan's book, which I speed read last night, so forgive me, Jordan, I've not read every line. But one of my favourite rules in Jordan's book is Rule 9, which says, assume the person you are listening to might know something you don't. And I think that in a country where men outnumber women by 2 to 1 in Parliament, in local government, where women's voices are not equally represented in media, where our education systems still are teaching boys and girls ideas of pink and blue. What I'm trying to do is work with thousands of optimistic, hopeful people for change.
Your boss called the gender pay gap a burning injustice. Is it?
Yes, it is, because there should be inequality of opportunity. There needs to be the same rights. But you know, something that surprised me, that neither of you, and the quality of outcome, sure, all of that. But the one thing both of you haven't mentioned is the biological difference, which unfortunately affects women's career prospects, whether we like it or not. Babies. And that does cause a problem. You know, if I were to take a sabbatical from a corporation for a while, it's going to set me back slightly. And it is a problem that biologically it's women who have babies, not men.
Sure, but that's why we are the Women's Equality Party is the only party in the UK that's got policies around shared parental leave.
She's so political.
We're the only party that has got fully costed plans for universal free childcare. One of the other things we want to do is to have a look at curriculums, to have more female role models, to encourage girls, because so long as we still see STEM as a boys' area that we're trying to get girls into, it's not going to work. We need to do the work we're doing on care, get more boys thinking about, nursing, teaching, more role models for boys in schools.
And
that's the way you break it all down.
Programs like EastEnders, The Archers, that's helped them a lot.
Right, so listen, I have to draw things to a conclusion. Can I just say how wonderful, 3 people, diverse political views, diverse views on many other issues, that get along famously and have wonderful conversations. Thank you.
The idea that there are no biological differences between men and women, it's the sort of thing you hear that, it just makes your jaw drop. So if the fundamentalist Christians say, well, if homosexuality is nothing but a sociocultural construct, then why do we have to put up with it? Wrong. Now, I got in trouble for saying that because what people claimed was that I was denying the existence of people who don't fit neatly into the gendered categories, which I wasn't doing at all. The campuses are overrun in large part with disciplines that have, in my estimation, no valid reason to exist. I think disciplines like women's studies should be defunded. Any of the activist disciplines whose primary role is the overthrow of, for example, of the patriarchy, which is about as ill-defined a concept as you could possibly formulate, that it's enough, that we've done enough public funding of that sort of thing. We're providing full-time, destructive employment for people who are doing nothing but causing trouble. I think they should be defunded because what they promote has zero intellectual credibility. Their research methods don't qualify as research methods. Their publications, 80% of humanities publications now garner 0 citations. That's not very many citations. And it's so, and the little trick, as far as I can tell, is what happens is that people write something that no one will read. They know perfectly well that no one will read it. They circulate it around their tiny group of compatriots who occupy the same little area on the intellectual spectrum. So then it's peer reviewed. Then it's published by major journals who sell it at inflated prices to libraries who squirreled away to and only increase the noise to signal ratio in relationship to the sum total of human knowledge. It's a scam from top to bottom. Here's one of the things that really bothered me about what was going on in Ontario, and this is happening everywhere, and I made this claim when I made my first video, since we have to get into this. So the technical claim in the Ontario legislation now, and this has already happened in New York, by the way. This is not only a Canadian thing. It's happening in Australia. It's happening in New Zealand. It's happening everywhere. Here's the claim. There's biological sex, there's gender identity, there's gender expression, and there's sexual proclivity, and they vary independently. That's not true. Not a bit of that is true. The correlation between biological sex and gender identity exceeds 0.99. It's virtually perfect. It's the very definition of non-independent. So you think almost everyone who's biologically male identifies as biologically male. Almost everyone who identifies as biologically male dresses and acts male. That's the gender identity element. And almost everybody who is biologically male, who identifies as male, who dresses as male, is in fact heterosexual. Those things are incredibly tightly linked, but the technical claim in the legislation is that they vary independently. Wrong. Now, I got in trouble for saying that because what people claimed was that I was denying the existence of people who don't fit neatly into the gendered categories, which I wasn't doing at all.
0.01 or whatever the percentage may be, that wouldn't fall neatly under that correlation. So certainly if there were a perfect correlation, that would work, but if there's not, it would seem perhaps that you're excluding certain people. Right? So if most people tend to identify a certain way, but there is that 0.01 that's not.
I was never denying their existence. Okay. I was denying the validity of the claim that those 4 levels of analysis existed independently of one another, which they don't. It's a false claim, and the reason that the radical social constructionists who are pursuing this line of reasoning, which is completely discredited as far as I'm concerned, I don't think it's any better than claiming that the world is flat. The reason that they're pursuing it legally is because they know perfectly well that they've lost the scientific discussion. I mean, I debated someone on Canadian public television who had the gall to say that the scientific consensus over the last 4 decades was that there was no biological differences between men and women. I mean, and that was one of the things that was so absolutely absurd about that, and there were many things that were absurd about it, was that I was in trouble with the university at that point, and he wasn't. It's like, first of all, that is not the scientific consensus of the last 4 decades. And the idea that there are no biological differences between men and women, it's the sort of thing you hear that, it just makes your jaw drop. Now, what you could say is that if you took all the dimensions along which men and women vary, and there's a substantial number of them, that there's substantial overlap between men and women on almost all of the dimensions. Now, that's not particularly true with chromosomal identity, although there are some exceptions. Like with personality, for example, and I happen to be somewhat of an expert on personality, there are marked differences between men and women, but the overlap exceeds the differences. So, for example, women are higher in agreeableness, and you might say, well, that's socioculturally constructed, but it turns out that it isn't, because if you look across cultures, and you look at the cultures that have moved most forward with gender equality provisions at the social and political levels, and that would be the Scandinavian countries, the differences in personality between men and women maximize in those countries. And these aren't tiny studies. These are studies that involve tens of thousands of people and that have been well replicated by a series of independent researchers. And so if you add the personality differences between men and women across all the personality traits, you can almost perfectly segregate men from women. And that has nothing, that doesn't take into account the obvious things like arm angle and hip width compared to waist width, and shoulder width and upper body strength and height and weight and the biochemical differences. And I mean, it's so preposterous that it's beyond conception to me that we're actually even discussing it. But I was making a specific claim, which is the law says these 4 levels of analysis vary independently. The only reason they're associated with one another is for cultural reasons. No, wrong. And you don't get to put fallacious scientific truths into the law. Or if you're going to do that, then I'm not going to abide by that particular law. I'm going to object to it, which is exactly what I should be doing. The law, as it's currently formulated, doesn't, in fact, it undermines the protection that these sorts of groups have been pursuing and seeking for years. So let's accept the proposition that these vary independently, or that they're only socio-culturally constructed. Okay, so where does that leave your discussion of homosexuality? So if the fundamentalist Christians say, well, if homosexuality is nothing but a socio-cultural construct, then why do we have to put up with it? It's a perfectly valid argument. You say, well, no, you know, people are born into their sexual proclivity. Now, I'm not saying that they are or not, because I'm not making either of those cases. What I am pointing out is that the legislation and policies of that sort, as currently formulated, actually undermine the very arguments that many of the activist groups have been using to promote the fact that they're deserving of their non-standard identity, that the non-standard identity is justifiable. If your sexual proclivity is nothing but a whim, then why should I put up with it? So, and I'm not willing in the slightest to presume that just because activist groups with this postmodern neo-Marxist ethic stand up and say, well, we're on the side of the oppressed, that makes them A, on the side of the oppressed, or B, virtuous. I don't buy either of those arguments. I don't think they stand for what they say they stand for. I don't think they're promoting a doctrine that's going to do what they claim it will do. I don't believe that they're good and the rest of the world bad. I don't buy their oppressor-victim dichotomy. I don't admire their philosophical position. I think they don't know anything about history, or if they do know anything about history, then they're malevolent for pursuing exactly the same policies that led us into terrible situations before.
Racism is a global and vague term.
Sorry, but why would you possibly do that? What did that mean?
Because I said it was a global and vague term.
The inverted commas as if it's not a real thing.
No, that isn't what it meant.
Well, what did it mean then? Explain.
It meant that it...
I know a lot of people who have staggeringly successful careers, and they're often loath to go into a political field despite the tremendous expertise they've developed, because they have to put everything that they've already accomplished on hold, or in hawk, in a sense, to enter the public sphere. And I think one of the problems with that is that the most highly competent people in many fields are dissuaded from a political career because it requires the unproductive sacrifice of everything they've built. And so what that does, in some sense, is deprive us of some of the best people who could be considering politics as a mode of public service. And so that's a complicated problem to try to solve.
Why do we assume that such people are the best people? They're obviously not the best people for the job.
Because they've demonstrated extreme competence in at least one area of
That's
inquiry.
banking, that's that persona. This is why we're in the situation where we are, with people like politicians that we have at the moment that are corrupt. There's no transparency, there's no accountability that you get in industry. We don't even have it in our politics at the moment.
But that's not why you have corruption.
Attitude that what is perceived as a good leader.
No, that's not why you have that problem.
Is.
Most people who are successful in their given field aren't corrupt. It's very difficult to become successful and be corrupt.
So
I know people like to think that, but it's just not true.
Corruption is good, it's acceptable.
Look, 3% of the population is psychopathic, and it never really goes above that. And the reason that it never goes above that is because being psychopathic is not a very good strategy. And so the idea that people in power are corrupt, by definition, especially if they've built up their stature and influence as a consequence of competence, is simply wrong. And so you do want people who've demonstrated high levels of competence in at least one other field to serve as potential political candidates. What else would you use as a criteria for their ability?
It's absolutely the case that institutions have a proclivity towards corruption under some circumstances. That's true of all institutions. But to blindly assume that that's more characteristic, let's say, of your political leaders than it is of you, for example, as a person, it's an empty sort of cynicism. It doesn't serve people well, and it's not true of reasonable governments or countries. It's simply not true.
The revelations from cricket's Azim Rafiq.
Former cricketer Azim Rafiq this morning stood before politicians ready to give his honest and powerful testimony about the racist treatment he says he was forced to endure during his time playing for Yorkshire County Cricket Club.
I felt isolated, humiliated at times, constant use of the word. In 2017 pre-season tour, we were in a place and Gary Balance walks over and goes, "Why are you talking to him? You know he's a or he's not a sheikh, he's got no oil."
And footballers still taking the knee. What does this say about racism as a continuing undercurrent in present-day Britain?
Things need to be particularized rather than generalized, as a general rule, let's say. And so this cricket player was facing racism by his own account. The question is, who, when, what, exactly? Because otherwise it degenerates into something like a discussion of structural racism. And when it becomes abstracted up to that level, first of all, that pits group against group, which I think is entirely counterproductive. And it actually doesn't address the issue. You know, racism is a global and vague term.
Sorry, but why would you possibly do that? What did that mean?
Because I said it was a global and vague term.
The inverted commas as if it's not a real thing.
No, that isn't what it meant.
Well, what did it mean then? Explain.
It meant that it's indicative of low resolution thinking. And what I mean by that is we use all these terms frequently in discussions like this that are
He was
containers of undifferentiated
He
content.
was repeatedly called abusive terms directly linked to his ethnicity.
By who?
By not just one, but repeated members of the Yorkshire Cricket Club. He's had people contacted him. If it walks like a duck, Jordan, talks like a duck,
I'm not
it's a duck. It's racism.
I'm not denying his experience.
Right.
What I asked was exactly who and when, and you just answered that question. So I would say those specific people should be held specifically to account for their actions before any movement up the abstraction hierarchy to a discussion of something like structural racism, which I don't think is helpful.
Well, he has talked about institutional racism in cricket. He says that's what he's experienced as a term, institutional racism.
Right, I know. And like I said, I believe that abstracting up the problem to that level of analysis does no good because it pits groups against groups. I think it exacerbates the problem. The concept of structural racism. It's too imprecise. It doesn't address the issue. Now that does not mean racism does not exist. That is not what I'm saying in the least.
Maybe let's do less of the hand movements and let's look at the evidence.
So yes,
there was.
I'll try
the
to
evidence
control
was
it in the future.
About the experience that Azim had, about multiple accounts. I think when we talk about structural racism, one of the things that really occurs to me, if I think about it in laymen and women's terms, is the bystander effect. And what is so powerful about his testimony is not just the explicit racism that he faced, it's the numbers of people who stood by and basically normalised that behaviour. We have a problem in British society, we have a problem particularly in sport, and we also have a problem when it comes to our definitions of racism, because people tend to lump people of different minority community backgrounds together. You know,
and how do you talk about structural racism?
I'm going to need to bring other people in as well.
But the thing for me that I think is so powerful is this concept of the bystander, is the idea of the person who may think of themselves not as a racist, who may not have joined in this poor young man being bullied in the way that he was.
I need to mention Stella simply because he has talked about it himself today, Azim Rafiq, that he has apologised for anti-Semitic tweets that he put out several years ago.
What I think is really powerful is how clear and compelling his apology is and how he's recognised it.
Why should your right to freedom of speech trump a trans person's right not to be offended?
Because in order to be able to think, you have to risk being offensive. I mean, look at the conversation we're having right now. You know, like you're certainly willing to risk offending me in the pursuit of truth. Why should you have the right to do that? It's been rather uncomfortable.
So you haven't sat there and... I'm just trying to work that out. I mean...
Ha, gotcha.
You have got me.
And that went viral. That made you very famous. Why do you think that sparked such a reaction?
Well, because I think that what I was saying was self-evidently true, but not expressed very well very often. I mean, look, most of the time when you're discussing something that needs to be discussed, everybody's actually rather upset about it. You know, if you're actually talking about something important, right? Because why talk otherwise, unless you're just shooting the breeze? But if there's an issue at hand that has to be discussed, then people are already upset and they have different viewpoints. And the offensiveness in some sense is built into that. And you know that because if you have a family, if you have a wife, if you have an intimate relationship, and you're discussing something that's difficult, the probability that you're not going to offend each other if you're actually having the conversation is zero. And so you don't have to think unless you have a problem. And if you have a problem, then when you think, you're going to offend people. And so what, are we not going to think? That seems like a bad idea.
Yeah. You're obviously not an American. We love to not think. But you know, I used to do a show called Politically Incorrect back in the 90s, and oh, thank you. Oh, the 90s, we remember them. And so I was always asked, what is your definition of political correctness? And I had to come up with one. I said, it's the elevation of sensitivity over truth, which seems like what it still is, except it's worse than ever.
It's more like the elevation of moral posturing about sensitivity over truth. It's even worse.
Yeah. So where did it come from? How did we get to this place where we're so fragile? The safe space people.
Oh, I think that you can pretty much blame it on the universities. I think that they've pursued, especially in the humanities and in the social sciences as well, they've pursued a policy of a radical leftist policy with an overlay of postmodernism, which kind of a literary criticism approach that's produced all of this. As far as I can tell, I think you can lay a lot of it at the feet of faculties like the faculties of education. There was an article in the Chronicle of Higher Education this week that just devastated the faculties of education, taking them to task for low academic standards and for possession by ideology and for basically indoctrinating people in a cult-like manner and playing identity politics and group identity. And
no free speech. They don't seem to. There was an incident in Fresno State. I don't know if you saw this, but Barbara Bush died. Okay, some professor there tweeted something nasty.
Yeah.
I wouldn't have tweeted it. She called Barbara Bush a racist and said she raised war criminals. Okay, you know, it's.
Yeah, well, the timing.
This crowd likes it, but I mean, it's nasty, and she's they're considering suspending her. And here's what the president of the university said. He said this was beyond free speech. This was disrespectful. Have we lost the thread back to knowing what free speech is? Yes, it can be disrespectful. That is covered under free speech. President of Fresno, you idiot! Jesus Christ!
Yeah. Well, and you see this too. I think where it's manifesting itself in a particularly appalling manner is in the increasing unwillingness of comedians, for example, to go on university campuses to be funny. And when comedians start...
I'm one of them.
Yeah, well, exactly.
Yeah, them. I'm not gonna... I call these people emotional hemophiliacs. You know, it's like the least little thing will make them start to bleed. But it makes me... because their answer is not to go into a room full of sharp objects. The answer is to make all of us wear bubble wrap.
Yeah, right.
So nothing we ever do makes them have a moment of discomfort. It's really very narcissistic.
Well, there's also this idea that's promoted by the people who are protecting those who are easily offended, that the way to make people secure is to protect them from things that they don't want to encounter. And there isn't a clinician, like I'm a trained clinical psychologist, and there isn't a clinician in the country who's worth his or her salt that would ever make that claim. First of all, it's hard to make people safe because life is seriously not safe.
Yes.
And the way that you make people resilient is by exposing them to things that they're afraid of and that make them uncomfortable voluntarily, but you use exposure.
Right.
And And so, like, if you over-coddle people, if you protect them from everything that's sharp, you make them dull and stupid and narcissistic, and it's a really bad idea.
So you do know America.
Good.
One thing I mean, your book is fantastic, and one of the rules that I really love is you say, don't let your kids do anything that would make you not like them. That's what I've been thinking for years when I call them the you mom generation. When I see kids, never in life because I never go near a child, but like on TV and movies, I see kids like saying you mom. And I'm like, if somebody who wasn't your child did that, you'd be immensely offended, whereas the parents just take it. What's up with that?
Well, people don't like to admit that they can dislike their children or children in general, and right. But they can.
No, they totally can.
One of the things you see very commonly as a clinical psychologist is family members who hate each other, and who it's like they have their hands around each other's necks for 20 years and are squeezing very slowly, trying to strangle each other. And you see parents who clearly detest their children and have ever since they were born. And part of that, I know it's a terrible way of looking at things, but it's true.
It's so true.
And one of the things,
No, parents confide that in me because I don't have kids.
Yeah, well,
no.
That makes it safe.
They do.
But
no, but they say things like, yeah, I love my kids, but if I had to do it over again, I wouldn't.
Yeah, well, okay.
Like, well, don't tell the kid that.
Well, but that's so bad. Look,
it is so
it's
bad.
So bad because the thing is about little kids is that little kids have a wonderful element to them, and most people spontaneously like little kids. They'll give them a chance, and if you have little kids, one of the things that's so wonderful about it is that when you bring them out into the world, even people who aren't in good shape, rough people, and who maybe don't have much patience for humanity, it brings out the best in them, you know? And so people are willing to give your kids a chance. But then if they misbehave, especially if they're rude and they don't have any respect and they're whiny and they don't know how to listen, then people don't like your kids and you don't. And then your kids go out into a world where no one likes them. And that's what you do to your kids if you don't like them, is you send them out into that world.
But how did parents get so whipped?
Well, I think parents are afraid of exercising authority because they tend to think that authority will crush the creative spirit of their child.
Oh,
that is...
See, everything this man says, I think is common sense.